Have you ever felt invisible? Not just overlooked. I mean truly invisible. Like you could scream at the top of your lungs in the middle of Main Street and the sound would just get swallowed by the dust. Like you're a ghost haunting the edges of a world that doesn't even know you're there. That was my life. My name is Elara Vance, and in the town of Redemption Gulch, I was less than a whisper. The dust here had a taste. Most folks would say it was just grit and horse manure, but to me, it tasted like being forgotten. It was a fine, pale powder that settled on the single dress I owned, got under my fingernails, and coated the back of my throat. A constant reminder. Before we get to the story, do me one quick favor. Hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on what's next. It takes 2 seconds, helps the channel more than you know, and gets you ready for one hell of a ride. Done? Okay, let's head to Redemption Gulch. You ain't nobody. You belong to no one. My days were measured by the rhythm of other people's lives. I was the girl who scrubbed their floors, washed their linens, and emptied their chamber pots before the sun got too high. I knew the secrets of this town by the stains on their clothes and the empty whiskey bottles they left behind. And I knew the Caldwells better than anyone. Their house wasn't like the others. It was a big, dark tomb of a place on the edge of town, trying to pretend it was still important. It stood there, proud and rotting from the inside out. My job was to keep the rot from showing on the surface. I'd polish their dark wood furniture until I could see my own face staring back, a tired girl with old fear in her eyes. Mrs. Caldwell, she had a smile as thin as a razor's edge. She'd give me a cold biscuit at the end of the day and call it charity. I knew what it really was. Payment to keep my mouth shut about what I saw, about what I heard. Because that house was drowning. Her husband, old man Caldwell, he paced the halls like a caged wolf. The ghost of bad bets and broken promises haunted his eyes. He never looked at me. He only ever looked through me, staring at some debt only he could see. And their son, Thomas. He was the worst of them. He had his mother's cruel smile and his father's desperation, all of it soaked in cheap whiskey. He'd watch me work, his eyes filled with a mean sort of emptiness that made the hair on my arm stand up. He was a lit fuse, just waiting for a reason to burn. I heard the whispers. Late at night when I was finishing up, their voices would carry through the floorboards. Hisses, not words. No more time. The men from Silver Creek. Everything we have. I didn't understand it all. I just knew it was the sound of a trap slowly closing. I should have run. I should have packed the few things I owned and walked until the dust of Redemption Gulch was just a bad memory. But a girl like me, where do you run to? Every town is just another cage with different bars. So I stayed. I kept my head down. I scrubbed their floors. I polished their silver. And I pretended I was deaf. That was the mistake that cost me everything. Because when you're invisible, you're the perfect person to blame. The morning it all ended started just like any other. The sun was a pale, watery thing, and the air was cold. I walked to the Caldwell house, my bucket swinging in my hand. But when I got to the back door, it wasn't Mrs. Caldwell who answered. It was Sheriff Corbin. He was a hard man, built out of leather and law. A man like Corbin doesn't show up for spilled milk. My heart started a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, his face a mask of stone. Then I saw her, Mrs. Caldwell standing behind him. Her face was a mess of tears, the fake kind, the kind you practice in a mirror. She pointed a trembling finger at me. Her voice, usually like honeyed poison, was now a ragged shriek that cut through the morning air. "That's her, Sheriff. That's the girl who took it. She took everything." The words didn't feel real. They floated in the air for a moment before they hit me. And they didn't hit me like a slap. They hit me like a bullet. My mouth went dry. The bucket slipped from my numb fingers and clattered on the stone steps. I tried to speak, to say my own name, to say anything, but my voice was a stranger in my throat. "Ma'am, I don't..." "She stole every last dollar we had," Mrs. Caldwell wailed, burying her face in her hands. "The money we were saving. Gone." Sheriff Corbin's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, settled on me. He didn't ask a single question. He didn't look for proof. He just looked at me. The orphan girl, the ghost, the nobody. And he saw a thief. It was that simple. He stepped forward, his hand closing around my arm like a steel trap. His touch was cold, final. "Elara Vance," he said, his voice flat and empty. "You're under arrest." I was dragged away. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I couldn't. My world had just tilted off its axis. As he pulled me toward the jailhouse, I looked back one last time at the big, dark house. The front door was closing, and I heard the sound of the lock clicking shut. That click. It wasn't just a lock. It was the sound of a key turning on my entire world. It was the sound of a grave being sealed, and I was the one being buried alive. That click. It wasn't just a lock. It was the sound of a key turning on my entire world. It was the sound of a grave being sealed, and I was the one being buried alive. The jail cell was a box carved out of cold stone and colder silence. Sheriff Corbin shoved me inside without a word, the iron door slamming shut behind me with a sound so final it shook the dust from the ceiling. The lock groaned, a long, mournful sound, and then nothing. I was left alone in the dark. Have you ever been in a silence so deep it has a sound of its own? It's a low hum, the sound of your own blood roaring in your ears. It's the sound of hopelessness settling in your bones. The air was thick with it, thick with the ghosts of all the poor souls who had sat on this same miserable cot before me. It smelled of damp earth, rust, and old despair. A single slit of a window near the ceiling let in a sliver of the world. Not enough to see anything, just enough to know there was a world out there. A world that was still turning, a world that had already forgotten me. Time became a strange thing. I measured it in slivers of light. The pale grey of dawn, the hard, bright white of noon, the long, blood-orange shadows of sunset. Then came the night, and the night was the worst. That's when I could hear the town. I could hear laughter from the saloon down the street. I could hear music, the clink of glasses, the sound of people living their lives while mine was already over. They were toasting and drinking, maybe even toasting to the swift justice of Redemption Gulch. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms around them, trying to make myself as small as possible, trying to disappear, but there was nowhere to go. There was only the cold stone, the humming silence, and the knowledge of what was coming. The first night, I cried. The second, I prayed. By the third, the tears were gone. The prayers were gone. All that was left was a strange, cold calm. A hard knot of certainty deep in my gut. I was innocent. It was the only thing I had left in the world. They could take my freedom. They could take my life. But they couldn't take that. I held onto it like a drowning man holds onto a piece of driftwood. It was my last piece of solid ground in a world that had turned to water. On the fourth day, they came for me. They didn't call it a trial. They called it a sentencing. There was no jury. There was no defense. There was only him. Judge Sterling. He sat behind a massive oak desk, a black-robed vulture perched and ready to feed. He wasn't a big man, but he filled the entire room with a kind of power that sucked the air out of your lungs. His face was a mask of self-righteous authority, his eyes small and hard like chips of obsidian. He looked at me and I saw nothing. No pity, no curiosity, no justice. I was just a loose thread he needed to snip. The Caldwells were there. Mrs. Caldwell dabbed at her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. Thomas stood beside her, his face flushed with whiskey, a smug little smirk playing on his lips. They told their story, a well-rehearsed lie that sounded almost believable if you didn't know the truth. They painted me as a cunning snake they had welcomed into their home only to be bitten. I tried to speak. I opened my mouth, a single word forming on my lips. No. But Judge Sterling raised a hand and my voice died in my throat. "We have heard enough from the accused," he boomed, his voice echoing in the small courtroom. It wasn't a room of law. It was his personal theater, and I was the unwilling star of his final act. He looked down at me from his perch, a cold satisfaction in his eyes. He enjoyed this. He savored it. "In a town built on trust," he began, his voice dripping with false piety, "the betrayal of that trust is the most heinous of crimes. It is a cancer that must be cut out before it can spread." He was talking about me. He called me a cancer. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. And then he delivered the final blow. "Elara Vance," he declared, the words sharp and final as a headsman's axe. "For the crime of theft and the betrayal of good Christian people, this court sentences you to be hanged by the neck until dead. The sentence will be carried out at dawn." Hanged by the neck? The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds. But then they sank in, deep into my bones, and the world tilted. The air left my body in a rush, and the faces in the room swam before my eyes. I felt Sheriff Corbin's hand on my arm, pulling me up, dragging me back to the cage. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't hear the laughter from the saloon anymore. The town was quiet, eerily quiet. And then I heard a new sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a hammer, steady, rhythmic. Someone was working late into the night, and I knew what they were building. They were building my gallows, right there in the center of town, for everyone to see. The sound of that hammer was the soundtrack to my final hours on this earth. Each blow was a nail in my coffin. Each thump was a second of my life ticking away. I didn't sleep. I sat on my cot, listening to the sounds of my own death being constructed. The cold calm I'd felt before was gone, replaced by a raw animal fear. This was real. This was happening. But somewhere, in the deepest, most hidden part of me, that little knot of truth was still there. I am innocent. As the first pale light of dawn bled through my window, the hammering stopped. The town was silent again. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence before a storm. The lock on my cell door groaned one last time. Sheriff Corbin stood there, his face grim. For the first time, he wouldn't meet my eyes. He just motioned with his head. It's time. The walk through town was the loneliest journey I'd ever taken. The air was cold and still. People lined the street, their faces pale in the morning light. They weren't a mob. They were worse. They were spectators. Some looked away, ashamed. Others stared with a hungry, morbid curiosity. I saw Mrs. Fletcher from the bakery, her face a mask of pity. I saw a group of miners, their faces hard and unreadable. I saw children, their eyes wide, not understanding what they were about to witness. I was a parade of one, a spectacle for their morning entertainment. And then I saw it. It stood in the center of the square, a dark, skeletal silhouette against the rising sun, new wood, raw and pale. It smelled of fresh-cut pine and finality. My gallows. My legs felt weak, like they might give out from under me, but I kept walking. I held my head high. If I was going to die, I was going to die as Elara Vance, not as the thief they wanted me to be. I took the final steps up onto the platform. The wood was rough under my feet. The whole town was spread out before me, a sea of silent, watching faces. And there, waiting for me, was him. The man who was going to kill me. Malachi Thorne, the town's hangman. He wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined a monster, a hulking brute with cruelty in his eyes. But Malachi Thorne was just a man, an old man. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, etched with deep lines, his hands gnarled and calloused from years of handling rope. But it was his eyes that struck me. They were empty, not cold, not cruel, just empty, like a house where no one had lived for a very long time. He moved with a slow, practiced efficiency, like a craftsman who knew his trade all too well. There was no emotion in his movements. This wasn't personal. It was just a job. Sheriff Corbin bound my hands behind my back, the rope biting into my skin. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, on the red-gold line of the sun breaking over the distant mountains. I wanted that to be the last thing I saw, the beauty of a world that I was about to leave. Malachi Thorne picked up the noose. It was a thick, coarse thing, expertly tied. He approached me, and for a fleeting second, his empty eyes met mine. I saw something flicker in their depths, a ghost of something. I couldn't tell what it was. It was gone as quickly as it came. He placed the rope over my head. The touch of it against my skin was obscene. It was rough, heavy, and it smelled of death. The finality of it stole the breath from my lungs. This was it, the last sunrise, the last breath. I closed my eyes. I thought of my mother's face. A memory faded like an old photograph. I whispered a silent prayer, not for my soul, but for the truth. Let someone know. I heard the heavy thud of Judge Sterling's voice from the balcony of his office. Let the sentence be carried out. I braced myself. I listened for the sound of the lever, the creak of the trapdoor, the sickening snap. I waited for the fall into darkness. I waited and waited. The silence stretched. It grew longer, taut, unnatural. What was happening? My eyes snapped open. The sun was brighter now, glinting off the metal of the sheriff's badge. The crowd below was murmuring, a low, confused buzz. Judge Sterling was leaning over his balcony, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. And Malachi Thorne. He was standing frozen. His hand was wrapped around the worn wooden handle of the lever. His knuckles were white, but he wasn't pulling. He was just standing there, staring at me, and his eyes weren't empty anymore. They were filled with a terrible, agonizing conflict. What is the meaning of this, Thorne? Judge Sterling's voice cracked like a whip across the square. Do your duty. Malachi didn't move. He didn't seem to hear him. It felt like the whole world had stopped, balanced on the edge of this single, impossible moment. He was looking at me, really looking at me, as if seeing me for the first time, not as a sentence to be carried out, but as a person, a girl of 19 with a rope around her neck. Sheriff, the judge barked. Compel him. Sheriff Corbin took a hesitant step forward. Malachi, what are you waiting for? And then, the hangman spoke. His voice was a low, rusty thing, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. But in the dead silence of the square, it carried like a cannon shot. Where's the evidence? The world stopped spinning. The murmuring crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would break free. Did he just say what I thought he said? Judge Sterling's face was a mask of pure fury. What did you say, you old fool? The evidence, Malachi repeated, and his voice was stronger now, harder, like a rock that had been buried for years and was finally seeing the sun. He wasn't looking at the judge, he was looking out at the crowd, at the whole town. What proof was there that she took the Caldwell family's money? A gasp rippled through the people below. This was unheard of. The hangman didn't ask questions. The hangman followed orders. He was the town's grim necessity, reliable, silent, final. A tiny, fragile thing unfurled in my chest. It felt like pain, but it wasn't. It was hope. A terrible, dangerous hope that I had been too afraid to even dream of. You forget your place, Ward, the judge bellowed, his voice trembling with rage. Your job is to carry out justice, not question it. Is it justice? Malachi said, turning his gaze back to the judge's balcony. Or is it convenience? I hear the whispers in this town. I know old man Caldwell has gambling debts that stretch clear to the next territory. I know his son drinks away more coin in a month than most of you see in a year. He took a step away from the lever. He walked towards me, his empty eyes now burning with a cold fire. They accuse the girl who has no one to speak for her, he said, his voice ringing with a truth so clear and sharp it hurt to hear. The very family that's been bleeding money for months. So I ask again, where is the trial? Where are the witnesses? He was standing in front of me now. He reached up, his rough, calloused hands moving towards the rope around my neck. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't afraid. My breath caught in my throat. I watched his hands, gnarled and weathered, the hands of a man who had ended lives, as they moved not to tighten the noose, but to take hold of it. He looked from the rope to my eyes, and then out at the sea of faces staring up at us in stunned silence. The entire town was holding its breath. Judge Sterling's voice was a venomous roar from his balcony. "Sheriff, arrest that man. He is obstructing justice. Finish the job yourself." Sheriff Corbin's hand went to the pistol at his hip, but he hesitated. His face was a canvas of confusion and conflict. He looked from the furious judge to the defiant Hangman, and then to me. He was a man of rules, of orders, but even he could feel that something fundamental was breaking apart in that square. The ground was shifting under all our feet. Before Corbin could make his choice, Malachi Thorne made his. He didn't pull on the noose. Instead, his other hand moved to the belt at his waist and drew a small, wicked-looking knife. It wasn't a fighting knife, it was a tool. The kind a man uses to cut rope. With a single, swift motion, he sliced through the thick, coarse fibers of the noose just above the knot. The blade flashed in the morning sun. The rope fell away from my neck, landing on the wooden platform with a soft, dull thud. I gasped, a raw, ragged sound, and my hands flew to my throat. The skin was raw, tender, but it was free. I was breathing air that wasn't measured. I was alive. The crowd below erupted. It wasn't a cheer. It wasn't a protest. It was an explosion of pure chaos. Some people shouted in outrage. Others cried out in support. It was the sound of a town tearing itself in two. "You've lost your mind, Thorne!" Sheriff Corbin yelled, finally drawing his weapon, but he didn't point it. He just held it, the barrel aimed at the sky, a man caught between two worlds. Malachi ignored him. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. Then he did something even more unthinkable. He took the same knife and sliced through the ropes binding my hands. The blood rushed back into my fingers with a pins and needles fire. I stumbled back, rubbing my wrists, my legs threatening to give out. Malachi stepped in front of me, shielding me with his own body. He faced the sheriff, the judge, the entire town, a lone old man against the world. "Maybe I just found my mind," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying over the din. It was then that I found my own voice again. The fear was still there, a cold snake in my belly, but something else was there too. Anger, a hot, righteous anger that burned away the last of my silence. "He's right," I said, my voice shaking, but clear. I stepped out from behind Malachi's protection. I had to. This was my truth to tell. The Caldwells needed someone to blame. I saw Thomas Caldwell at Murphy's gambling parlor 2 nights before they accused me. I was cleaning late. He lost everything. I heard him curse the devil himself, said he'd lost more than his father could ever pay back. A new murmur rippled through the crowd. Murphy's parlor was an open secret. Young Thomas's gambling problem was, too. The pieces were starting to click into place in people's minds. You could almost see it on their faces. Judge Sterling knew he was losing control. His face was purple with rage. "Enough of this circus. This is not a trial. This is an execution." And then he made his move. He turned to the shadows near the courthouse steps. "Blackwood," he screamed, "earn your pay." A cold dread washed over me, colder than the fear of the noose. Everyone knew the Blackwood brothers. They weren't lawmen. They were hired guns. Killers who worked for the highest bidder. 3 men detached themselves from the shadows. Luther, the eldest, stepped forward, a cruel smile on his face, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt. His eyes were like a snake's, cold and flat. They swept over the chaotic crowd, dismissing them, before settling on Malachi, and then on me. "The judge wants order restored," Luther Blackwood announced, his voice smooth as oil and twice as slick. "And he wants the girl hung. Anyone who interferes, well, you'll be interfering with justice, and we don't take kindly to that." The courage of the crowd began to falter. These weren't men you could reason with. These weren't men with a conscience to appeal to. They were death for hire. I felt a hand on my arm. It was Malachi, pulling me back behind him. "This isn't justice," he growled at Luther. "This is murder for coin." Luther's smile widened. "Justice is whatever the man who pays me says it is. Now step aside, old man. This doesn't have to concern you." But I wouldn't be hidden again. I wouldn't be silenced. I had been a victim for the last time. I stepped out again, my heart pounding a wild rhythm against my ribs. I looked straight at Luther Blackwood, straight into those dead eyes. "Before you kill an innocent woman," I said, my voice ringing across the now silent square, "you should ask your employer, Judge Sterling, about his business arrangement with the Caldwell family." Judge Sterling went pale. "Silence her. Shoot her now." But I kept talking, the words tumbling out of me, a flood of truth that couldn't be stopped. The Caldwells owed money to dangerous men. The judge offered them a deal: find a scapegoat for their stolen money, and he'd see them executed quick and quiet. No messy trial, no investigation that might uncover who the Caldwells really owed. The judge gets a cut for his troubles. And I was the perfect choice, wasn't I? An orphan girl, no family, no one to ask questions. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. You could feel the shock. They knew Sterling was harsh, but this was a different kind of evil. Luther Blackwood's hand froze on its way to his gun. He looked from me to the sputtering, white-faced judge on the balcony. He was a killer, but he was also a businessman. Massacring half the town in broad daylight in front of witnesses wasn't part of the deal. It was then that an old, familiar voice cut through the tension. "He's right to hesitate," said Dr. Alistair Finch, pushing his way to the front of the crowd, his medical bag in one hand. His voice carried the weight of a man who had delivered half the people in this town and mended the bones of the other half. "Luther Blackwood, you stand down. You'll not murder this child in front of us." And then, the most amazing thing happened. The baker, Mr. Abernathy, stepped up beside the doctor. Then his wife, Eleanor. Then the blacksmith. His big arms crossed over his chest. One by one, people began to step forward. They weren't armed. They didn't have guns. They just stood there. They formed a wall. A wall of ordinary people, standing between me and the killers. A wall of bodies, right there in the town square. A wall built of nothing but shame and courage, and the sudden, terrible realization of what they had almost let happen. The wall of people was not a fortress of stone, but it might as well have been. It was made of something stronger, a shared, sudden conscience. Luther Blackwood looked at the faces, the baker he bought bread from, the doctor who'd set his brother's arm last winter, the blacksmith who shoed his horse. He was a killer, but he wasn't a fool. There's a difference between a quiet job in an alley and a public massacre. One was business. The other was a one-way ticket to a federal gallows. His younger brother, Wade, nervously licked his lips. "Lou," he muttered, his voice low. "This ain't what we signed up for." "We signed up for whatever pays," Luther growled back, but the conviction was gone from his voice. His cold eyes darted from the line of townspeople to the judge's balcony, as if calculating a new set of odds. Judge Sterling, seeing his authority and his hired guns wavering, flew into a final, desperate rage. "I'll triple your fee," he screamed, his voice cracking. "Just finish this. Kill them all if you have to." The order hung in the air, naked and ugly. He had said it. He had ordered the murder of his own citizens. Dr. Finch took another step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Luther Crane," he said, using a name I'd never heard. "Your mother was Sarah Crane, wasn't she? Lived on Elm Street. A good woman. Raised you boys on her own after the mine collapse. I delivered you, son. Patched you up more times than I can count. She would weep to see what you've become." A flicker of something, not anger, but a deep, buried pain, crossed Luther's face. "Don't you talk about my mother. She'd want you to do right by this girl," the doctor pressed, his voice softening. "Just like she did for every lost soul that came to her door. She never turned anyone away." It was then I realized. I knew that name. Sarah Crane. My voice was soft, but in the tense silence, everyone heard it. "I knew your mother, Mr. Crane." Luther's head snapped towards me, his eyes filled with a raw confusion. "I was 12 years old," I said, the memory clear as day. "I hadn't eaten in 2 days. She found me sleeping behind the church. She didn't ask questions. She just took me to her boarding house, gave me a bowl of hot stew, and paid me a penny to scrub her kitchen floor. She was kind to me. His gun hand, which had been hovering over his pistol, dropped to his side. The killer's mask fell away, and for a split second I saw the boy he must have been, the boy his mother had raised. Sheriff Corbin saw the moment too. He saw the crack in the armor. "Luther, walk away," he said, his voice firm now, the voice of a lawman finally choosing his side. "Walk away now, and this ends without any more blood." But Judge Sterling was beyond reason. His reign was crumbling, and he was going to take everyone down with him. From the folds of his black coat, he produced his own weapon, a small, silver-plated derringer that glinted wickedly in the sun. "If you won't do your job," he shrieked, his face a twisted mask of madness, "I'll do it myself." A single shot rang out across the square, but his target wasn't me. It wasn't Malachi. He aimed at Luther Crane, the man who had dared to hesitate. Luther cried out, stumbling back, clutching his shoulder as a dark stain spread across his shirt. His brothers, Wade and Caleb, reacted instantly. Their guns were out in a flash, but they weren't aimed at the crowd. They were aimed at Judge Hollister. "You shot him!" Wade yelled, his face a picture of shocked disbelief. "You shot our brother!" The judge's sanity finally snapped. "I'll shoot anyone who defies me. This is my town." But it wasn't his town anymore. Sheriff Corbin made his final choice. He raised his own pistol, its barrel steady, and pointed it squarely at the man on the balcony. "Hollister, you are under arrest for corruption, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder." "You can't arrest me," the judge screamed, waving his little silver gun wildly. "I am the law." "Not anymore," Corbin said grimly. And then, another sound cut through the chaos. The thunder of hooves. Not one or two horses, but a dozen, riding hard into town. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought they were more of the judge's men. But the lead rider wore a badge that shone brighter than the judge's silver pistol. A United States Marshal's star. He reined in his horse in the center of the square, his eyes taking in the whole impossible scene in a single sweeping glance. The gallows, the wounded man, the armed citizens, the hangman standing beside me, and the judge on his balcony holding a smoking gun. "I'm Marshal Kane," he announced, his voice carrying an authority that made the judge's power seem like a child's tantrum. "We've been investigating reports of corruption in this territory for months." He looked up at Judge Sterling, a grim smile touching his lips. "Looks like we arrived just in time." The silver derringer clattered from the judge's numb fingers onto the wooden floor of the balcony. The fight went out of him. The madness in his eyes was replaced by the flat, dead certainty of a man whose world had just ended. Federal marshals, federal justice. His reign of terror was over. The tension of the morning, of the past week, of my entire life, finally broke. My legs gave out, and I sagged against Malachi. He held me steady, his old, frail-looking arm surprisingly strong. I was alive. I was free. The truth was out. But as I looked around at the shocked faces, the wounded man being tended to by Dr. Finch, the deputies taking a broken Judge Hollister into custody, I knew that the real work was just beginning. How do you rebuild a town that has almost torn itself apart? How do you heal the wounds left by lies and greed and the terrible, terrible power of silence? The arrival of Marshal Kane was like a cold, clean storm washing over the town. His deputies moved with a quiet, disciplined purpose that made our local brand of justice look like a clumsy bar fight. They took Judge Hollister into custody without ceremony, his face ashen, all the fight drained out of him. He was just a small, old man in a black coat now, stripped of his power. Dr. Finch was already tending to Luther Crane, pressing a clean cloth to the gunshot wound in his shoulder. "It's clean through," the doctor announced to the marshal. "He'll live, thanks to some poor aim and the grace of God." Marshal Kane dismounted, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a solid thud. He surveyed the scene, the empty noose swinging gently in the breeze, the circle of armed townspeople, Sheriff Corbin holstering his weapon, and me still standing beside the town's hangman. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. "Someone want to tell me what in the Sam Hill happened here?" he asked, his voice calm but demanding. Sheriff Corbin stepped forward, his face weary but resolute. "We were about to execute an innocent girl, Marshal. Silas Ward here," he nodded toward Malachi. "He stopped it. He was the only one with the courage to ask for proof." The Marshal's eyebrows shot up. "The hangman stopped an execution?" He looked at Malachi with a new respect. "I've been a lawman for 30 years. I ain't never heard of that." I finally found the strength to speak. My voice was hoarse, but it was my own. "The Henderson family owed gambling debts, Marshal. Judge Hollister arranged for me to be accused and executed quickly, so no one would find out where their money really went. It was a lie. All of it." One of the deputies led Marcus Henderson and his son forward. The old man wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the ground, his confession tumbling out in broken, shame-filled pieces. He told them about the men from Silver Creek, about the threats, about the judge's solution. Young Thomas, sober for the first time in weeks from pure terror, admitted he'd lost all the family money in a desperate 3-night gambling binge. Marshal Kane listened to it all, his expression unchanging. He'd seen this kind of rot before. "Judge Hollister will face federal charges," he said finally. "This territory can't afford to have wolves guarding the sheep." He then turned his attention to the remaining Crane brothers, who were watching over Luther. "And what about you boys?" Wade Crane looked up, his face pale. "We were just hired to keep order, Marshal." "You were hired to commit murder," Kane corrected him bluntly. "But from what I can tell, when the time came, you chose not to. That has to count for something. You stay put. We'll sort this out." Finally, the Marshal's gaze settled on Malachi, and then on me. He looked at the old hangman for a long moment. 23 years, I hear. 23 years of pulling that lever without a question. What changed today, Mr. Ward?" Malachi, Silas, was quiet. He looked at the faces around him, the people he'd lived with for decades but had never truly seen. He looked at the gallows, his own handiwork. Then he looked at me. "I reckon I realized that following a bad order doesn't make you a good soldier," he said, his voice low and raspy. "It just makes you the final link in a chain of evil. I was tired of being that link." Kane nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes. "Well said." He looked around the square, at the dazed but relieved faces of the townspeople. "This town is going to need a new judge, and a hell of a lot of healing." As the sun climbed higher, the square began to clear. The deputies took the prisoners away. Dr. Finch took Luther Crane to his office to be properly patched up. The Henderson family was taken for further questioning. The real work was just beginning. The hard, messy business of rebuilding trust, of learning to speak up, of making sure a day like this could never happen again. I stood there, watching it all, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. It felt like the first real sun I'd felt in my entire life. A shadow fell over me, and I looked up to see Malachi, Silas, standing there. He was just an old man now, his shoulders slumped with the weight of the morning. "Are you all right, child?" he asked, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. "I think so." I looked at his gnarled hands, the hands that had both placed the noose around my neck and cut it away. "Why?" I whispered. "Why did you do it?" He looked at the gallows, then back at me. A sad, weary smile touched his lips. "Because for the first time," he said, his voice full of a regret that spanned decades, "I looked at the person standing on that platform, and I saw someone's daughter. And I figured that was enough. And in that moment, I knew that while the marshal had brought the law, it was this old, quiet man who had brought justice back to Redemption Gulch. 3 months passed. The kind of time that doesn't just move forward, but actively heals. The gallows in the town square were gone. The first thing the town council did, with Sheriff Corbin presiding, was to vote unanimously to tear it down. Silas Ward himself took the axe to the main beam. I watched him do it. Each swing wasn't one of anger, but of release. In its place now stood a small community garden, and I was its keeper. I spent my mornings there, my hands in the rich, dark earth, coaxing new life from the very ground that had been soaked in fear. Planting tomatoes and squash felt like an act of defiance, a prayer. Where they had built an instrument of death, I would cultivate life. The territorial government, prompted by Marshal Kane's scathing report, had abolished the position of town executioner. Silas Ward was a hangman no more. He'd gone back to his first trade, carpentry. His hands, once heavy with the weight of rope, were now light with the feel of good, honest wood. He built cradles for new babies, mended roofs for widows, and put the finishing touches on the new desks for the schoolhouse, my schoolhouse. With a small fund started by Dr. Finch and Marshal Kane, I had opened a school for the town's children in the old, abandoned land office. I taught them to read and write, to do their sums. But more than that, I tried to teach them to ask questions, to think for themselves. I wanted them to have the voice I never had. One afternoon, as I was packing up, Silas appeared at the door. He held a small, beautifully crafted wooden bird in his hands. He'd carved it himself. "For the children," he said gruffly, not quite meeting my eye. He was still a man of few words. "They ask about you, you know," I said, taking the bird. It was smooth and perfect in my hand. "They call you the man who said no." A faint smile touched his lips. "I just stopped doing something that was wrong." "Sometimes, Silas," I said gently, "that's the bravest thing a man can do." The town was changing in other ways too. Sheriff Corbin was still the law, but he was a different man. He listened more. He walked the town not just with authority, but with a kind of quiet humility. He'd never forget how close he'd come to enforcing a fatal lie. With Marshal Kane's help, Marcus Henderson had worked out a payment plan with his creditors. It turned out, once the threat of violence was gone, they were more interested in getting their money back than in breaking legs. Young Thomas had stopped drinking. He took a job at the livery stable, doing hard, honest work for the first time in his life. He still couldn't look me in the eye, but the smugness was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding shame. That was a start. Judge Hollister was serving a life sentence in a federal prison hundreds of miles away. His name was already becoming a cautionary tale parents told their children. And Luther Crane? In the biggest surprise of all, he'd stayed. After he recovered, Sheriff Corbin offered him a job as a deputy. The town was skeptical at first, but Luther's near-death experience had burned something out of him. The coldness was gone. He used his fearsome reputation not to intimidate, but to keep real troublemakers in line, and he was surprisingly protective of the town's weaker citizens. He knew, better than anyone, what it was like to be on the wrong end of a corrupt man's gun. One evening, Silas and I sat on the bench by the new garden, watching the sun set. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and blooming night phlox. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him quietly. "Giving up your position? Risking everything?" He was silent for a long time, watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. "Every morning," he said, his voice low, "I wake up and my hands feel light. For 23 years they felt heavy. Heavy with the weight of what I had to do. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have clean hands." He looked at me, his old eyes clear. "I don't have regrets, Elara. I have gratitude. You gave me back my own soul." I shook my head, a small smile on my lips. "It wasn't me who gave you courage, Silas. It was always there. You just buried it so deep you forgot where you'd put it." We sat in comfortable silence as the last light faded. The gallows were gone, but the memory of them remained, a stark reminder that justice without mercy isn't justice at all. It's just violence wearing a badge. Our town had learned that lesson, written in blood and fear. I had found my purpose, Silas had found his redemption, and Redemption Gulch had finally started to live up to its name. We had learned that the most important laws aren't written in legal books or carved on stone. They're written in the human heart. And sometimes, it just takes one person speaking one simple truth to teach the whole world how to read them again. The dust has settled in Redemption Gulch. The gallows are gone, the corrupt judge is in chains, and the silence of fear has been replaced by the sound of a carpenter's hammer and children learning to read. It's easy to close the book on a story like that and feel a sense of satisfaction. Justice was served, the good guys won. But if that's all we take away, we've missed the point entirely. The story of Elara Vance and Malachi Thorne isn't just a tale from the Wild West. It isn't about heroes in white hats and villains in black robes. It's a story about us. It's a story about the quiet, terrifying moments in our own lives when we stand before a choice. It's about the levers we all hold in our hands every single day. Let's talk about that lever. For Malachi, it was a literal piece of worn metal that would open a trapdoor. For 23 years, pulling it was his job. It was his purpose. It was what the law, the system, and the entire town expected of him. He wasn't supposed to think. He was just supposed to obey. How many of us have a lever like that in our own lives? It might not be made of metal. Maybe it's the send button on an email that forwards a piece of harmful gossip. Maybe it's the choice to stay silent in a meeting when a colleague's good idea is being unfairly shot down. Maybe it's the laugh we force out when someone tells a cruel joke because we don't want to make things awkward. Maybe it's the simple act of looking away when we see an injustice, big or small, because getting involved is just too messy, too risky. These are our levers. And we are told, every day, in 1,000 different ways, to just pull them. Follow the rules. Don't rock the boat. Go with the flow. It's what everyone else is doing. It's easier. It's safer. But Malachi's story teaches us the first and most powerful lesson. Our greatest power is found in the moment we choose. His hesitation was an earthquake. His one question, "Where's the evidence?" was more powerful than the judge's gavel, the thong doc's gun, and the entire weight of a corrupt system. He reminded us that blind obedience is not a virtue, it's an abdication of our own conscience. True strength isn't in following orders, it's in having the courage to question the orders that are wrong. This leads to the second crucial lesson, the one embodied by Elara Vance. We must challenge the convenient narrative. Elara was the perfect scapegoat. She was poor, she was an orphan, she had no one to speak for her. The story that she was a thief was easy. It was simple. It solved the Caldwell's problem and gave the town a quick, clean villain. It was a comfortable lie. Our world is drowning in convenient narratives. We see it on social media, where complex issues are boiled down into angry memes. We see it in the workplace, where it's easier to blame the new guy for a project's failure than to examine the systemic flaws. We see it in our communities, where we apply labels to people based on where they live or what they look like, because it's easier than getting to know their individual story. Elara's truth was messy and inconvenient. It involved gambling debts, family shame, and corruption, but it was the truth. The story teaches us that we have a responsibility to be skeptical of the easy answer, to ask the second question, to look for the full story, not just the headline, to recognize when a person is being turned into a caricature, a scapegoat, to serve someone else's agenda. We must have the courage to look for the Elara in the story and ask, what if the simple version isn't the true one? But what if you're not the hangman and you're not the accused? What if you're just someone in the crowd? This is where the third and perhaps most vital lesson lies. Silence is a choice, and the crowd has a power it rarely knows it holds. At the beginning of the story, the crowd gathered with an ugly energy. They were spectators at a blood sport. Their silence was a form of consent. By just standing there, by watching without protest, they were participants in the injustice. They were part of the machine that was about to kill an innocent girl. Their apathy was the grease on the gears of Judge Sterling's corrupt system. How often are we part of that silent crowd? We see someone being bullied online and we just scroll past. We hear about injustice in a faraway place and we change the channel. We see a neighbor struggling and we close our curtains, telling ourselves it's not our business. But look what happened when that crowd changed. When Dr. Finch stepped forward, he broke the spell. When the blacksmith and the baker's wife joined him, they created a new reality. They transformed from passive spectators into active guardians. They became a human wall. They proved that the most powerful force in any community isn't the man with the gavel or the man with the gun. It's the collective will of the people when they finally decide to stand together. Their lesson is that our presence matters. Our voice matters. We don't have to be the hero of the story to change its ending. Sometimes all we have to do is refuse to be a silent bystander. We just have to choose to be part of the wall. Finally, the story teaches us something beautiful about what comes after the crisis. Redemption is not a gift. It is an action. Malachi Thorne didn't just apologize for his past. He tore down the gallows and picked up a hammer. He started building instead of destroying. Luther Blackwood didn't just regret his life as a hired gun. He pinned on a deputy's badge and started protecting the very people he was once paid to threaten. Redemption isn't about erasing the past, it's about building a different future. It's a trade. You trade a rope for a hammer. You trade a gun for a badge. You trade a garden of death for a garden of life. This applies not just to individuals, but to the whole town. Redemption Gulch had to earn its name. It had to actively heal, rebuild trust, and create a new system based on truth, not fear. It's a reminder that our past mistakes do not have to define our future, as long as we are willing to do the hard work of making things right. The gallows may be gone, but the town square is everywhere. It's in our workplaces, our families, our online communities, and in the quiet chambers of our own hearts. Every day, we are faced with our own versions of a corrupt judge, an innocent victim, and a crowd on the verge of making a choice. This story from the Old West holds a mirror up to our modern lives and asks us a very simple, very difficult question. When your moment comes, which part will you play? So the story of Redemption Gulch isn't just a story about dust and desperation from a time long past. It's a story about the choices that define us, right here, right now. It reminds us that one person's courage can crack the foundation of a lie, that a community, united, is more powerful than any tyrant, and that it's never, ever too late to stop pulling the lever and start building something better. The question the story leaves us with is this: what lever is in front of you today, and what will you choose to do with it? If this story moved you, if it made you think, then help us share this message. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what's coming next. More importantly, share this video with someone you know who needs to be reminded of their own strength, of the power of their own voice. And finally, drop a comment below. I want to know, what was the biggest lesson you took away from this story? Your stories and your insights are what make this community so powerful. Thank you for watching. Stay brave, stay true, and remember that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is simply say, no. We have more tales of courage, justice, and the untamed human spirit coming your way soon. We'll see you then.